I would start with a question of what is your goal by spending time in the US? Is it because you want to hire US talent? Is it because you want to do a go to market, do a land and expand in some segment of the US market for B2B software? Is it because you want to access US investors, right?
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Off to the Valley, the show where we uncover extraordinary stories of individuals who've embraced change and ventured into new territories. I'm Pratik Panda, your host, passionate about sharing tales of resilience and exploration. Today, we have the privilege of speaking with Dexter Zhuang. Dexter is the founder of Money Abroad, a transformative media business empowering professionals to build wealth overseas. His journey is a testament to courage and redefining success on his terms. Dexter's path to entrepreneurship took him from climbing the tech career ladder to discovering a deeper purpose beyond financial milestones. His journeys inspired him to create Money Abroad, a platform that has gained significant traction and earned acclaim from influential platforms such as being featured among LinkedIn Top Voice, FinCon, and others. Through his journey, Dexter has challenged conventional notions of financial independence, embraced a holistic approach that integrates work into life rather than striving for balance. His story of personal growth and professional evolution is an inspiring example of pursuing passion and authenticity. Dexter, it's wonderful to have you on the show, and we are excited to learn more about your journey.
Thanks so much for having me on here, Pratik. Yeah, excited for our conversation.
Let's get started by getting to know you a little bit more. Tell me about Dexter as a kid, as you were growing up. Where did you grow up? What was your background and surroundings like? And how that has influenced you to be who you are today?
Absolutely. So I'll start off with my parents. My parents are both from Shanghai, China, and they experienced the communist revolution. And afterwards, around the late 80s, they decided that they want to move out of China for better opportunities. So my dad was the first one to actually move to Canada, and my mom followed shortly. I was actually born in Canada. And then when I was 5, we moved to Michigan, where I spent the rest of my childhood and teenage years. So in Michigan, it's very much of a Midwestern culture. So if you're not familiar with the different parts of America, a lot of people that I meet outside the US think of the US as like a giant homogenous culture, but that could be further from the truth. If you spend time in different states in the US, you can see different types of cultures. So the Midwest culture is known for being a little bit more down to earth, a bit more humble, not as out there as people you might see from New York or California. So that's kind of the environment that I grew up in. With that said, after spending my teenage years there, I really wanted it to get out and experience things outside of my Midwest suburb. So I went to a out of state college. I went to Dartmouth, which is on the East Coast. And then afterwards, I started experiencing more of what was happening in Silicon Valley just through very lucky relationships. I met some entrepreneurs who were spending time there. So I interned there at Udemy and then decided, okay, I got to join this whole Silicon Valley thing. This was the early 2010s. So Facebook had just IPO'd, and that was a very exciting time.
Dartmouth is a great school to be at. And do you think that played an influential role in you eventually moving to Silicon Valley?
At the time when I went to Dartmouth, I was maybe one of 10 people that I knew from my graduating class out of about 1,000 people who chose to move to San Francisco that year.
Oh, well.
It was not common because keep in mind, this was early 2010s. It was just after the Great Recession. And yes, Facebook had just IPO'd, but I think there was still skepticism of whether or not this tech boom would be long lasting or if it was just a short term kind of one off. So most of my peers went into consulting or financial services, your typical kind of like high performing professions and career tracks. But for me, I was really excited about what I saw when I was interning at Udemy, the potential of working in a small company making a big impact, and then working with some of the best and brightest of our generation, meeting amazing founders. Like I remember as an intern, I got to sit in on, well, just be in a small group with Drew Klauston um, from Dropbox, and also Dustin Moskovitz from Asana, because they just met with interns, and it was a very cool exposure. So I felt like this seems way more exciting to be here in this kind of context, meeting all these interesting people rather than spending time pursuing financial services, which is what my parents wanted me to do.
Okay. Coming from Asian background myself as well, I can understand the pressure that Asian families can put on their kids to follow a particular path. But hey, you are successful and you've taken an unconventional path, and that's what this show is all about. So tell me a little bit more about your time in the valley. Did you have a good time? How long did you spend in Silicon Valley? Yeah, let's start there.
Absolutely. I had a really great experience in Silicon Valley looking back on that chapter of my career. I was there for about 6 years. I just worked really hard, worked my way up the career ladder. I worked at a growth stage startup called Creative Live right out of school, and that eventually got acquired by Fiverr after I left. And then I wanted to go somewhere a little bit bigger to learn from more of the best and brightest in product management because that was the career path that I was on. So I applied to a bunch of different companies, got an offer from Dropbox on their growth product management team, and joined then when it was only 6 people. Eventually, we scaled that team to over 70. This was pre IPO. So I also got to help scale that business through IPO. And it was really unique to be there at that point in time because product led growth, while you see that everywhere now, that was still very new and kind of mysterious at that point in time. So I felt very fortunate to be there at the ground floor building that product led growth business. And I work primarily on the prosumer side of the Dropbox business. So at the time, we called it Dropbox Pro, eventually Dropbox Plus as well. And that was a very cool experience. I got to ship features that drove millions in revenue, run tens of experiments that impacted millions of people. So I learned a lot about myself at that point in time. And after that Dropbox experience kind of wrapped up after the IPO, and I felt like, okay, I've learned kind of everything I wanted to learn from this experience. I thought about what else I wanted to do next. And at that point of my career, my focus was really on, okay, I've experienced certain kind of things I wanted to do, but what type of company do I want to experience next? What kind of life experience I wanted to experience next? Because I had spent most of my first 6 years working pretty hard, like 50, 60 hours a week at these roles. And what I decided for myself at that point in time was that I actually wanted to take a bit of time off. I felt a little bit burned out from that period, and I wanted to explore and see what else was out there, especially outside of the US. Given my immigrant upbringing and through some childhood, high school experiences, I got some exposure to people from outside of the US, and I was really curious about what working outside the US might look like. So at that point in time, I decided, okay, I want to take some time off and do some traveling. So traveled across Southeast Asia, Europe, and South America. I did a 1 year travel sabbatical. I actually, at that point in time, gave up 2 offers from startups that were my dream jobs at the time. That was a tough decision, but I'm grateful for the decision I made. And after that traveling, I liked Southeast Asia the best. There was a lot of really interesting things happening there, both from like a career perspective. The tech industry was starting to boom. This was the late 2010s. And I wanted to explore building a career there. And from a lifestyle perspective, it also gave me an opportunity to travel across a new region and see different parts of Vietnam, different parts of Indonesia, just experience a whole different lens. And my core values include things like curiosity and adventure. So working internationally was something I was just always curious about.
That's amazing, Dexter. There are so many questions I want to ask you from there. But first things first, I want to get to the point where we talk a little bit about the fact that you're not in San Francisco anymore. So, where are you right now? Why did you choose to move out of the US?
Absolutely. So yeah, right now I'm in Mexico City, and my wife and I are spending some time in Latin America. I know that sounds a little bit weird. Like you just talked about Southeast Asia and Singapore. Why are you in Mexico right now? So I will do my best to explain. Um, in 2020, right before COVID, I moved to Singapore, which is also a crazy story because I almost basically got blocked at the border because of COVID. So I barely got into the country by a few days. And I joined a Series A fintech startup in Singapore, which focused on Indonesia and was expanding to the Philippines at that point in time, called Zendit, and helped them scale their product team from 4 billion in transaction volume to over 15 billion in transaction volume. And I was there for about 3 years. So up until the beginning of last year. And that was my first time building in an emerging market kind of context, which is totally different from building in a more mature market like the US. But this was what I wanted. I wanted to experience a new market and a new challenge in this kind of context. So that was at a high level what happened in Singapore. And the reason why my wife and I are spending some time in the Latin American region is because we also spent time there in 2019 on this travel sabbatical and loved our experience in the region. We really were excited about learning Spanish at that point in time. We took a month, 1 month intensive, and now we want to improve on that. So we're actually trying to level up our Spanish at the moment, and I want to gain some level of fluency. My ideal would be to speak in a professional context. I had a professional opportunity to work with a client recently, but they were like, "Oh, you don't speak fluent enough Spanish, so maybe not." I now have the chip on my shoulder, so now I want to address that.
That's amazing. It's funny that you said that, Dexter, because very recently I was telling a friend of mine that I would want to learn a new language, but I want to learn it in a different way and not on like Duolingo. I want to, for example, go to Portugal and spend 6 months and learn from a local language instructor, but at the same time, also experience local culture, be in a smaller city or smaller town so that I can experience true local culture while also learning a new language. And I think that's very interesting when you try to learn a new language and you are also trying to correlate it with culture. Something amazing comes out of that, right? I've not been able to
Absolutely,
do it yet, but hopefully your journey is inspiring. Hopefully I'll get a chance to do it sometime soon.
you totally
Um,
should.
but
I think
tell
it's a
me,
very fun way to learn languages because you end up meeting people and you
yeah,
are more motivated to build relationships. So you learn Spanish for that purpose instead of talking to Duolingo.
you can learn your lessons from the previous day in a coffee shop the next day.
Exactly. Exactly.
Great. So tell me this. You're in Mexico City. I'm sure there are some things that you love about being in Mexico City, and then maybe there are some things that don't quite hit the right spot. Are there any such things that you miss from your time in Silicon Valley or in Singapore?
That's a good question. So when I was in Singapore, I think one of the highlights of Singapore is just how easy it is to get around and how convenient it
Okay.
is. If you haven't been to Singapore before, Singapore is a travel hub for Southeast Asia. It has an incredible airport, the Chang Airport. It's also incredibly good with public transit, and even the roads are pretty sparse with cars. So I lived in Robertson Key in Singapore, which is kind of far away. Like if you look on a map, it looks kind of far away from the airport, but door to door, it probably took 15 minutes of a grab ride to get from my apartment to Changi Airport. And public transit was good enough that I could walk to the metro station in 10 minutes or less. In Mexico City and a lot of Latin countries, I think the infrastructure is less developed. So while I live in a nice neighborhood right now called Roma Sur, and walking around is very easy, and it's easy to meet up with friends or colleagues here. It's a bit harder to get to other parts of the city because of that infrastructure, and traffic gets also really bad.
Okay.
So that would be one big difference.
Do you miss anything from a startup ecosystem or that whole startup energy perspective?
That's a good question. So I think there's different dynamics to the startup ecosystem in, let's say, Silicon Valley to Southeast Asia to Mexico and Latin America. Here's just my observation. I'd be curious to hear, your observation and other folks' observations around this. But working in Silicon Valley, I notice we're pretty advanced in the way that the market is structured and how we're thinking about things like go to market. Like there's a whole SMB segment of the market that can leverage product led growth motions, right? That was what I was doing at Dropbox. That's a little bit less common of a go to market in, let's say, Southeast Asia or Latin America for a number of reasons. And rightfully so. Now, Southeast Asia is less mature of a tech and startup ecosystem. But what's interesting is that it really started picking up in the early 2010s, and that culminated with companies like Grab and Sea going public just a couple years ago. So during that whole decade, I think there was a lot of energy and a lot of investment going into startups, and governments were pushing at that as well. For example, Singapore had the NUS, which is one of the universities. They had an overseas college in Silicon Valley. So students could actually do a work exchange in Silicon Valley through that university. I worked with some colleagues who went through that program, and that gave them exposure to Silicon Valley really early on. So certain governments in that region did a lot of work to try to absorb that Silicon Valley DNA, or at least like import a lot of it and learn as much as possible so that they could grow homegrown talents.
That's amazing. Another aspect, I think, as founders, it is challenging to be an entrepreneur, right? You have more often than not, you have difficult days than you have great days. So I feel like people say it's a roller coaster, but it's still a roller coaster journey, but you see a lot more lows than you see highs. And the highs can be really high, but the lows can be pathetically low. I've moved around a lot as well. And I grew up in India, spent 2 years in Singapore, moved
Mm.
to California for 6 years, and I've been in Vancouver the last year in Canada. And every place is different in its own way. But one of the essential things that I feel is important to keep me sane is some sense of community, right? So you try to build a small network of people that you can count on, that you can meet more frequently, that you can share and talk to. Um, how have you approached this sort of element of community when you first moved to Singapore or when you're now in Mexico City? How do you go about finding that sense of community?
I totally agree. Community is one of the most essential parts of what keeps me fueled in terms of me as a person. And of course, as an entrepreneur or doing business, I want to stay motivated. So I would say when I first moved to Singapore, I put in a lot of work before I moved to identify people. Also, I was doing a job search. So I kind of killed two birds with one stone here. I was reaching out to a lot of people who were in the tech industry who I thought were interesting. So some of those people may have been investors that I noticed were interesting. Some of them were product managers like me, and some of them were American tech people from Silicon Valley who moved to Singapore like me as well. So I reached out to those people and built relationships. I made a couple of visits to Singapore before my wife and I actually moved there more permanently. And that really helped, I think, cultivate those relationships early on, even before I touched down on the ground. Then once I settled down into Singapore, I could work on building more relationships through like friends of friends or asking people, hey, who else do you think I should meet? And that helped me meet more people and eventually become long term friends with some of those people. I approached Mexico City a little bit differently because I had some friends of friends already based in Mexico City, and that made it a little bit easier to get started. So I jump started my relationships in Mexico City through those existing relationships and then asking them again, hey, who else do you think I should talk to? And then spending at least a few months being more in the mode of saying yes to everything instead of no to everything.
Yeah, I think that's a key thing, right? Like the more you say yes to certain things, especially when you're early in a journey somewhere, it definitely leads to a lot more opportunity and things typically fall your way. Before we talk more about where to be based and stuff like that, I have more questions on that. Tell us a little bit more about your current startup, Money Abroad.
Absolutely. Money abroad was something I started earlier last year, and I was just transitioning out of Zenda at that point in time. And the reason why I started Money Abroad was I was getting experience working in all these different countries like Singapore, and then also working with companies in Indonesia and Vietnam, and now in Latin America. And like many high achievers, I climbed that career ladder. But while I was growing my career, I felt like I was fumbling with my money. Like I was just getting confused about what to do, especially since I was moving around. I wasn't quite clear on what my goals were or what my strategies were. So I chose a default path when I was in my 20s of, okay, I hear a lot of people talking about FIRE, which stands for financial independence, retiring early. That's become really, really popular, especially on the internet. And I think it's actually a great community. But for me, it just turned out to be an awkward fit. And the reason why that is because it motivated me to achieve certain net worth milestones. And the more and more I did that, then it kind of felt a bit more empty and meaningless. I felt afraid of, okay, what do I do then if I'm not achieving net worth milestones? Isn't that the whole point of personal finances? So I talked to different friends facing similar challenges, studied the masters on finances, managing money, also things like portfolio careers, fractional work, small businesses, because I think career is also a big aspect of money because it also determines things like your earnings. And then I experimented with applying those lessons to my own money path and also entrepreneurial path. So Money Abroad is a culmination of those lessons, and it's focused on helping high performers design independent money paths. It started with content and especially a newsletter, grown to over 6,000 subscribers and over 25,000
That's amazing.
followers across social channels. And more importantly, I've also just changed my perspective on finances. It's less about, okay, I got to achieve a certain net worth milestone. And it's more about, okay, there's a lifestyle that I want to have, and then a certain type of business that I would like to build. And what are the money things that you need to consider to get them?
That's amazing. But hey, looks like you finally became a financial consultant, a financial advisor, making the parents happy.
Oh man, yeah, don't tell them that.
Uh, it's interesting. I feel this pain because I've moved around a lot and I like moving around a lot. A lot of times I feel like I'm generally good with my money, but every time you move, I think this is difficult for everyone to understand unless you've moved around a lot. Like you don't have a 401k contribution anymore. You move to a different country and that stops. Do you do something else? So, how do you plan retirement? Where do you put most of your money? If there is not one place you can really call home, and you really don't know where you're going to be based, right? So, I think it gets complicated very soon. I think I'm going to spend some time with Money Abroad and sign up and I learn more as well because I'm definitely feeling some gaps in my money strategy as I move around a lot and figure stuff out. What are some of the things that people are experiencing as they work with you at Money Abroad? Like, what do they learn? How is it changing their lives? What did they come back and tell you?
Great topic that you mentioned earlier on. Okay, you're moving around a lot, and then if you're thinking long term, then where do you save? Where do you invest? I think that is a reflection of a changing attitude towards work and towards how we want to even live, right? People are more interested in moving outside of their home country and spending time in new countries than ever before, but maybe immigration or tax systems have not caught up to that growing trend. So, one of the things that I've been spending more time in just myself because I'm an American, then I have to understand, okay, from a American perspective, what can I do with my home country kind of retirement accounts? Can I still invest in my American brokerage? And fortunately, the short answer is yes. Those accounts that I have created before I left can still be used. However, that does vary, yeah, country by country. And each country may have different policies around that. But one of the things that I've learned is there's also a group of people who ask the question, okay, how do I, as a self made person, build some wealth? I think that's the question that I get a lot. And I think it was Nick Majuli, who posted recently on LinkedIn about this, which I liked a lot. He said he observes that the people that he knows who build self-made wealth generally do it in three ways. It's either through really long-term investing, which is you invest for over 30 years. You hit it big with like a IPO or an exit, or you develop a high income and a high savings rate. And when I reflect on all the people that I know who were not born into money, it feels like that does resonate and that does seem like it pans out in my circle as well. So that naturally lends to the point of if you start with that success case and work backwards from that success case, then you learn a few things, right? You learn that one of the strategies is if you're in your early career, then growing your income and savings is probably one of the biggest levers. I think as a founder, obviously you don't want to sacrifice all of your business profits on that. But I think that's something to be mindful of is because the first 10 years of your savings can make an outsized impact in terms of your long term investing if you're growing your income quickly. And tip number two there is then to continue investing into low fee investments. So that's why I prefer. This is not financial advice. I'm not giving any financial advice. I'm not a financial advisor or professional on that. No. So to put out that caveat, but I prefer long-term index funds where it's low fees because fees turns out to be one of the biggest and most expensive mistakes I've seen people make, especially people living overseas because they tend to work with either wealth managers at banks or wealth managers at wealth management firms who may sign them up for a fund that sounds good on the outset, but actually charges a pretty high fee and they just didn't pay attention. So those are some examples of tips. The last one I would say is the one I learned most personally in the last year to design your own money path, right? To start with your ideal kind of lifestyle and think from a psychological perspective, what makes you feel good in using your money on? Like, is it building your business? Is it spending money on your family, friends? Is it buying a really beautiful house in the mountains? Or what do you enjoy the most? And then use that to decide how much money do you need to allocate to certain things.
That makes sense. Tell me this, you've worked with a lot of founders. What is one common money mistake that founders are making?
One common money mistake that I've at least seen the founders in my circle make. I had a conversation with a founder friend recently, and for him during I think he started his startup before COVID, but then during COVID, there was a rough patch. He was a venture backed founder. He raised from some of the top names in Silicon Valley. And he, for the good of the business, decided I'm not going to pay myself any salary. Like it's a hard time. I'm going to just grind it out. And what ended up happening is that he ended up having to exit his business on not the best terms. And he didn't end up winding up with a whole lot of savings from that. And that also impacted his optionality for what he could do afterwards. So I think for founders who are in a venture back kind of context, I would just watch out for how much are you paying yourself, even during the hard times, because even after you can debate this, I think there's different points of view on this. But if something doesn't go according to plan, then what do you end up having?
That's interesting. I think that's been consistent with a lot of founders that I've spoken to also. And although the caveat is that we don't usually talk a lot about money, I think that's another problem, right? Like as founders, you have a group of other founders that you talk to more frequently, and you talk about a lot of problems around the business, around growth, around raising money or whatever. But rarely do we talk about how poorly we might be doing ourselves with our own personal finance. And I think it's consistent for a lot of founders, at least in the early part of their journey. I'm not talking about founders who start their companies maybe later on in their career where they've established some sort of a financial cushion, but a lot of founders who start young, whose first job is doing a startup. And more often than not, you're so focused, rightly so, so focused on the business that you rarely think about your own personal finance unless something goes wrong, which is situations like COVID and other things that are environmental factors, which we have limited control over. And when those situations hit us, that's when we start thinking, oops.
One of my favorite investment ideas is margin of safety. So
Mhm.
Warren Buffett talks about margin of safety a lot when he's making an investment decision. He's looking for a margin of safety in that investment decision, which just means that if, let's say, he buys this asset, maybe it's a stake in a company, and his stake value drops by over 30% or 20%, is he still going to be able to make returns from that eventually? And that's something that he builds into his own investment framework. And I like that a lot. Margin of safety is something that I've tried to
Yeah.
factor into not just my investment decisions, but also my career and business decisions as well.
I think that's great advice. Talking about margin of safety, a lot of founders are trying real hard to move to the US, set up their business there. They might already have a business there, but they are physically not based in the US yet. Immigration can be tough. I've been on that side of the spectrum as well. You've chosen, I would say, the rather unconventional path of having grown up in the US, worked in Silicon Valley, but now chose to move out of Silicon Valley, move out of the US as such. What if somebody is struggling to be in the US or trying to think if there are other alternatives? What are a few advices that you could give that helps people figure a path outside of the US?
I would start with a question of what is your goal by spending time in the US? Is it because you want to hire US talent? Is it because you want to do a go to market, do a land and expand in some segment of the US market for B2B software? Is it because you want to access US investors? Right. I think there's a number of different goals, and I think you can be very specific about those particular goals. And there may be alternatives to actually moving to the US and establishing yourself in the US that help you reach those goals. Perhaps a bit slower, or perhaps not in a perfect kind of way, but they get you maybe 80% of the way there. So, for example, perhaps you are interested in accessing US investors in a particular city? Is that something that you need to be based there? Or can you just fly in every once in a while to go meet those investors? That is debatable, but I've seen some founders succeed by doing the fly-in approach versus the you're based there kind of approach. Just off the top of my head, I'm thinking like Canva and Atlassian did not start off in the US, right? They started off from Sydney, Australia, which is like the furthest country from the US as well.
That's great advice. Before we wrap up, Dexter, I have a rather fun question for you. If you had the chance to spend some time on a lunch or a dinner with someone, anybody, it could be anybody in the world, who would you pick and why?
Oh man, that's a really good question. I think right now I'm very curious about, we just talked about Warren Buffett, so I'll put Warren Buffett on that list. I think he would be really interesting to spend some time on, especially because this past year, Charlie Munger passed away, his business partner, and it feels like there's a whole lot of stories and legends around Berkshire Hathaway and how they built that business. That'd be very curious to learn that.
Yeah, and I think talking about Warren Buffett, one thing a lot of us don't realize is he made a lot of his money towards the last 15, 20 years of his life rather than in the early days. And I think that's also a big lesson for all of us in patience. So
Totally.
you have to stay consistent and be patient and watch your money grow by making the right investments, of course. But I think a lot of times we make life more difficult for ourselves because we need things sooner. And more often than not, we need things now. So that's where it becomes a struggle. I think that's one of the things that I keep reminding myself every time Warren Buffett comes up is just be patient. There's a long way to go and definitely a lot to learn from him.
Absolutely. And I think someone interviewed Charlie Munger before he passed, rest in peace, and asked him the question, what is one thing that you miss or that you wish you had that you don't have? And for him, it was his youth. He missed
Mm,
the ability to go and be physically active. I can't recall which exact activity. I think he liked fishing. So he wanted to spend more
yeah.
time doing those kind of activities.
Actually, since you mentioned that, right, I want to ask you one last question about sabbatical. I have a friend from my last company. He was also a product leader who is currently doing a 6 month sabbatical in South America. And I've been following his journey on Twitter and it's exciting, right? And I'm seeing a lot more people take the plunge, take small breaks. Do you have, in your experience, having spent a year in sabbatical, do you think there is a particular formula? The reason I'm asking this is a lot of people think that a sabbatical is a good idea, but are never able to take one. And then Lenny Rachitsky, in one of his interviews, mentioned how he thinks that he started off taking a 6 month sabbatical, which eventually became a 12-month sabbatical. And from there, launched Lenny's newsletter, and it's hugely popular. It's a community around the world. Thousands of people meet up every month physically as well as online and learn so much from that community, right? And maybe it would not have happened if he wouldn't have taken that sabbatical. So, in your experience, is there something you can tell people to encourage them to take a sabbatical?
For sure. I'll share why a sabbatical and then I'll share maybe one tip for the sabbatical. So I would encourage everyone listening to consider a sabbatical at different, let's say, milestones in your career and your life journey. The reason why is because when we're really busy, we don't have a whole lot of time to fully process the events that preceded us, whether that's building our startups, whether that is life experiences. And because of that, we are not processing fully also our own emotional experiences around those things. We're not processing fully the lessons learned and the insights around those things. And one of the beautiful parts of a sabbatical is you get to carve out space to intentionally get those insights. and to learn more about yourself. So that's how I felt about my sabbatical. That was really an amazing opportunity to learn more about myself. The tip that I have is that I'm someone who is very structured. I would say one of my strengths is structured thinking, and I apply that to my work and to my career. But on my sabbatical, what I learned is I had to let go of that structure. And the most valuable part of the sabbatical was actually letting go of a set calendar and set schedule. And after it takes about 4 to 5 weeks, I would say. So my tip here is to be unstructured and then do that for at least 4 to 5 weeks, preferably six. And you will just notice changes with the way that you behave, the way you feel, the things you even think about. And it's just very interesting because you are the same person, but you are experiencing a totally different dimension of yourself.
That is amazing, Dexter. I think it's consistent with one of the talks that Lenny was giving, and it's consistent with a couple of people who I know who took short sabbaticals as well, where I think it easily takes you 6 weeks, sometimes 8 weeks to get to a stable state where your mind is now able to rest, because we are so used to running according to our calendar, our schedules, whether it's work, personal, life just keeps going on, that you need that much time to really slow down. And I think Lenny also in one of his interviews tells that a 6 month sabbatical is ideal because 3 months is what typically most tech companies would let you take without causing a lot of concern. I think that is also a place of privilege. Not a lot of people have that privilege to take a 3 month sabbatical and still come back to a job waiting for them. So if you have that privilege, definitely take it. But 3 months flies by with you just trying to come to a state of calm and peace before which you can start even thinking like, okay, what next? Or what do I want to experience and so on. But it's amazing that you got a chance to spend an entire year. I'm hoping for a sabbatical sometime soon. So let's see when that happens. But thank you so much, Dexter, for spending time with us. It was an amazing conversation. Lots of valuable advice around where to be based, why the US is not the only place to be in, financial advice for founders, and sabbaticals. I think we've had a very good conversation. Thank you for spending time with
Thanks
us.
so much for having me, Pratik. Loved our conversation. It was super fun.
And that wraps up today's episode. Before we sign off, I would like to thank you for your support and thanks for tuning in. If you loved today's episode, then don't forget to subscribe to this podcast and never miss an episode. Be kind, be happy, challenge the norm. I'll see you folks again for the next one.